If you've ever wondered whether the great civilizations of the past truly celebrated knowledge or quietly buried it, then what you're about to read will change the way you see history forever. Stay with us, because this is one of those stories that gets more astonishing the deeper you go. There is a particular kind of tragedy that doesn't announce itself with fire or sword. It arrives quietly in the form of a sentence, a dismissal, a label, a verdict handed down by someone with enough authority to make it stick. And sometimes that sentence is enough to erase a man from history entirely, or at the very least, to cast a long, dark shadow over everything he ever built. This is the story of one such man, and it is also the story of a civilization that at one of its most intellectually fertile moments chose to look away from one of its own greatest minds. His name was Jabir ibn Hayyan, and the charge leveled against him by one of the most influential religious scholars in Islamic history was that he was nothing more than a sorcerer. Let that sink in for a moment. Jabir ibn Hayyan is widely regarded today as the father of chemistry. He was born in the city of Tus in the region of Khorasan, present-day Iran, and grew up in Kufa, Iraq, during one of the most intellectually vibrant periods of early Islamic civilization. He studied under Imam Jafar al-Sadiq, drawing from both the spiritual and the rational traditions of his time. What he produced over the course of his life was nothing short of extraordinary. Hundreds of texts spanning chemistry, medicine, pharmacy, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. He was the first to introduce systematic experimentation into the natural sciences. He discovered and documented processes like distillation, sublimation, crystallization, and filtration. He distinguished between acids and alkalis, described sulfuric and nitric acids, and even outlined a method of creating fire-resistant paper. He explored the transformation of metals and wrote about what we would today call chemical reactions in terms that would not seem out of place in a modern laboratory. His legacy traveled far beyond the Islamic world. European scholars translated his works into Latin and built upon his foundations to establish what we now call modern chemistry. They knew him by the Latinized form of his name, Geber. For centuries, his writings were among the most referenced scientific texts in the Western Academy. And yet, within his own tradition, he was declared a ghost, and worse, a fraud. The scholar responsible for this verdict was Ibn Taymiyyah, one of the most formidable theological minds of the medieval Islamic world. In his writings, Ibn Taymiyyah dismissed Jabir in terms that were both sweeping and deeply damaging. He declared that Jabir was unknown among the people of religious knowledge, that there was no mention of him among scholars worthy of the name, and that even if one were to prove his existence, the only thing that existence would confirm is that he was among the great sorcerers of the faith, a man who occupied himself with alchemy, poisons, magic, and talismans, and who bore responsibility for introducing such arts into Islamic civilization. With a stroke of the pen, a man who spent his life in service to human knowledge was recast as a practitioner of the occult. To understand why this happened, we have to understand the intellectual and theological climate of the era. Ibn Taymiyyah operated from a framework in which anything perceived as mimicking or competing with the creative power of God was inherently suspect.
alchemy, with its ambitions of transformation, its mysterious processes, its suggestion that the natural world could be manipulated and reshaped, fit uncomfortably within that framework. It looked, to certain eyes, less like science and more like an attempt to usurp divine prerogative. And because Jabir worked at the intersection of the material and the mysterious, because his methods were not yet separated by the clean lines we now draw between science and pseudoscience, it was all too easy to collapse the distinction between chemistry as a discipline and magic as a practice.
There is also, lurking just beneath the surface of this debate, a question that historians have not always been willing to ask aloud. Was the rejection of Jabir, at least in part, a sectarian one? Jabir was a Shia Muslim, deeply connected to the lineage of Imam Jafar al-Sadiq. Ibn Taymiyyah held views that placed him in sharp theological opposition to the Shia tradition. It is difficult to look at the harshness of his dismissal, not merely disagreement, but outright denial of Jabir's existence as a legitimate scholar, and not wonder whether doctrinal hostility sharpened the blade of intellectual condemnation. A man who wrote hundreds of books does not become unknown by accident. The cost of this dismissal, however, was not paid by Jabir alone. It was paid by an entire civilization. At the very moment that Islamic scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah were closing the door on figures like Jabir, European scholars were throwing that same door wide open. They were translating his works, incorporating his methods, building laboratories and academies on the intellectual scaffolding he had constructed. The irony is almost painful. The West built its scientific revolution partly on foundations laid by an Islamic scholar who had been declared non-existent by his own tradition. This is what happens when orthodoxy is allowed to perform the work of scholarship. When the authority to determine who counts as a thinker is handed to those whose primary concern is theological purity rather than empirical truth, the result is not the protection of faith, it is the impoverishment of civilization. It is important to be fair here. Even Taymiyyah was a thinker of real depth and genuine intellectual seriousness. He was not a simple man, and his critique of alchemy was not made without some internal logic. Within his worldview, certain concerns were legitimate, and he was himself, on many matters, a voice for careful reasoning rather than blind acceptance. But even great thinkers have blind spots, and when those blind spots are combined with institutional authority, the damage they do can outlast the man by centuries. The question we're left with is not merely a historical one. It is urgent and contemporary. How many Jabirs have there been across different eras, different cultures, different traditions, whose work was buried not because it was wrong, but because it was threatening to those who held the power to define what counted as legitimate knowledge? How many civilizations have slowed their own progress by turning their finest minds into suspects? History is not a sacred text immune to revision. It is a living record, written and rewritten by those who hold the pen and the pulpit. The story of Jabir ibn Hayyan was written once as the story of a sorcerer. It can and must be written again as the story of a visionary, a pioneer, one of the true architects of human understanding. He was not a fraud. He was not a ghost.
He was a scientist, centuries ahead of his time, working in a world that was not always ready for what he had to offer. And the civilization that dismissed him paid a price for that dismissal that it may not have fully reckoned with even now. That reckoning is long overdue. If this kind of story moves you, the kind that pulls back the curtain on what history chose to hide, then you already know what to do. Drop your thoughts below, because conversations like this one only get richer when more minds join in. And if you believe these silenced voices deserve to be heard, sharing this is the most powerful thing you can do.